It's been a little while since we were in John 9, so let's just reset the context here, because the first verse of chapter 10 flows right out of the last verse of chapter 9. It's part of the same dialogue. So, chapter 9 was the powerful story of Jesus giving sight to a man born blind, and the confrontation that Jesus had with the leaders at the temple as a result of the fact that he healed this man on the Sabbath day. And in that closing part of chapter 9, Jesus once again met with the now seeing man who got to see Jesus for the first time. And we have that powerful scene of that man declaring his faith in Jesus and worshiping him. And then some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt, but now that you say, we see, your guilt remains." And then we pick it up, the very next sentence in chapter 10. Truly, truly. Remember that phrase, truly, truly, or as the King James says, verily, verily. That's where Jesus is declaring something that has the authority of Scripture. This is absolutely true. I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. If you read chapter 10 in isolation from chapter 9, just pick up your Bible and open it to chapter 10 and start reading. You can read it as sweet, peaceful meditation on Jesus. Taken in isolation, it can be read that way. The gentle, good shepherd and his beloved sheep. It's a kind of a storybook image. It's the kind of thing that artists over the years have loved to paint. Jesus as the good shepherd with his shepherd's crook and the flock around him. But reading it that way misses the close ties that this has with chapter 9. And to properly understand it, you've got to understand its broader context. There's even a clue or two in chapter 10, verse 21. Some of Jesus' critics had been talking and says, and some others were defending Jesus, and they said, "These are not the words of one who is oppressed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" So he's making reference back to what had happened in the previous chapter, Jesus giving sight to the blind. Likewise, in both chapters, we have Jesus in confrontation with these people referred to as the Jews. And if you will recall from earlier discussions, the Jews in John's Gospel almost invariably refer to the religious leaders, the heads of the synagogues, the chief priests, and the other people who are in charge of the temple. The Jews, as John uses that phrase, almost always refers to these people. And clearly, the confrontation that Jesus had in chapter 9 slops over into chapter 10, and he's dealing with the same people, the same issues again. From chapter 8, verse 59 to chapter 10, verse 39. You're dealing with a block of material that needs to be read together, and the story of Jesus confronting the Jews kind of runs full circle through that passage. So think of it as a single literary unit when you read through John's Gospel. In most of chapter 10, there is an extended contrast made by Jesus between the authority and leadership that he represented on the one hand, and the very different authority and leadership exercised by his influential opponents, the Jews, on the other hand. The Jews were opposed to Jesus. They were opposed to Jesus. They were opposed to Jesus' message. They were afraid of Jesus, and they were afraid of his message. They saw in what he was saying and doing a threat to their own position. That threat could have been revealed in a couple different ways. The less worrisome way was simply that the crowds would be drawn to Jesus and away from the religious leaders. So there it's a matter of clashing egos and clashing priorities. These are folks who like to be in charge. And the idea that Jesus would be a rival for the attention and the affection of the crowds was threatening to them. There was a more worrisome threat that they perceived Jesus represented, though. And that was that if he were to come out openly and declare himself the Messiah, that knowing the emotions and the drives and the desires of the crowd, it would have inevitably led to an armed insurrection. And whether Jesus desired it or not, the Jewish leaders saw in him somebody who could trigger a revolt, who could become a popular catalyst for a revolt, somebody that the many would-be revolutionaries in Judea and Galilee would rally around and use him as the focal point for them to get into an armed rebellion against Rome. And the popular notion that the Jewish people could overthrow the Romans might have made great dinner time conversation around the table in some little village hovel. But among the political and military and economic leaders of Israel in their mansions in Jerusalem, they didn't labor under any such false notions. They had seen the power of Rome up close. They knew that such a revolt could only end in disaster. And so they made a calculated choice. They didn't like the Romans any more than the common people did. But they were going to make the best of a bad situation. And so they got in bed with the enemy. And they cut deals. And they came to agreements. And they found a way to work with the ones that oppressed them for their own personal benefit and gain. Jesus threatened all of that. The religious leaders looked at him and said, this can only end in disaster for us personally and possibly for the whole nation. Jesus' words in chapter 10, verse 1 follow without interruption what he was saying at the end of chapter 9. With the sober authority of one who speaks God's words, he says, I tell you the truth. Verily, verily. Truly, truly, I tell you. And he began to describe the leadership style and character of those highly influential Pharisees who denied their own need for the light that Jesus offered and the life that he promised. And he uses a common metaphor. The idea of sheep and shepherds and an enclosure where the sheep were kept. Not familiar with it, let me kind of clue you in on the way sheep were raised in first century Palestine. If you were to go to Australia and see the big sheep stations out in the outback, you'd be looking at raising sheep in a way that never would have entered the wildest imaginations of first century shepherds in Judea. Nothing about that would seem familiar. What is done on an enormous scale in places like Australia, New Zealand, some parts of the American West, is the complete opposite of the way sheep were raised in the first century Palestine, where it was done on a very small scale, on a very intimate scale. You know, modern day sheep raising they don't shepherd sheep, they ranch them. But what they did in the first century, there was a very close, intimate relationship between the shepherd and his flock. And the flocks were small. A really huge flock might have numbered 100. Typically, they were smaller than that. It was a world in which labor was cheap. And so labor-intensive ways of doing things were economically feasible. We live in a world in which labor is usually the biggest cost. And so we're looking for ways to cut down on the labor costs, mechanize it, do it on a bigger scale. Just the opposite was the economic reality of first century Judea. And so it made economic sense for one man to tend a small flock of sheep full time. And in that process, the shepherd got to know the sheep and the sheep got to know the shepherd. And sheep, once they are imprinted on a shepherd, will recognize his face, they'll recognize his voice, they'll recognize the way he walks across the field, they will know him, they will trust him. Because they will learn in time that he is there to get them food, to get them water, to protect them from predators, and so a close bond develops between shepherd and sheep. That's part of the picture. There's another piece here, and that's the idea of a sheepfold and a gatekeeper. Let's say you've got in an area somewhere out in the hills outside of Jerusalem 10 different small-time shepherds, each one with a flock that will vary from 20 to 80 sheep. Now, no matter how dedicated a shepherd is, sometime he's got to get some sleep. You know, he can't watch the sheep 24 hours a day fully alert. There are times when, because of weather conditions or other situations, the sheep need to come in from the fields into a safe, protected spot. And so there were sheepfolds in which flocks from various shepherds would be brought in and they would be kept together in this place. And the walls of the sheepfold would, it could be made of stone, it could be made of thorny bushes, it could be living hedges of thorny bushes, sticks, whatever was available. I saw years ago on a mission trip, I was in Djibouti in East Africa, the Horn of Africa. A place I don't recommend that you look into as a vacation spot. It was the most depressing place I think I've ever been. I've described it, I think accurately, as an inflamed boil on the buttocks of the world. I mean, it is a terrible place. And it is barren desert. And the day I was there, the missionary I was working with, we were looking for Somalis who had herds of goats or camels that needed to be vaccinated. That was that missionary's entree with the people as he was trying to bring the gospel to them. And we got way out in the desert, and we came across a guy who had a fold, if you would, that he had created to keep his goats in. And it could have been taken right out of first century Judea. It was rocks and thorn bushes and sticks, whatever he could scratch together to make a wall that would keep the goats in and the predators out. And it was pretty effective, frankly. Those thorns are about that long. You didn't want to mess with it. So that's the kind of thing. It's got, it's a big circle or oval, or it might have an irregular shape, but it's only got one entrance. And they make those walls as inaccessible as possible. They make them high. The thorns are real effective. You don't want to mess with thorns. And so they might have had layers of rocks topped with thorns. And anybody that wants to steal those sheep has got to get through all that somehow. Because the only opening is where the gatekeeper sits. And at night, he would literally sleep across the gate, so that you had to get over or past him in order to get in. Jesus uses this metaphor, and everybody in his room, in his audience, would have immediately recognized it. It's something they all would have seen. And he said, well, he who enters by the door is the shepherd. The gatekeeper opens, the sheep hear his voice, and this image, and I'd love to see this in real life. The shepherd comes to the door, the gatekeeper recognizes him. He pulls back the barrier, and the shepherd begins to call to his sheep. And there might be 200 sheep in that corral, but only the ones that belong to that shepherd would respond to his voice. They'd know him. They'd come a-running. The others might well be afraid of him. They might run away. But his sheep are going to come to him. And so, there's no complicated process of trying to sort through the sheep. If this were modern day sheep, with the modern day ranching methods, they'd be out there looking for tags on their ears to try to figure out which sheep belong to who. Not a problem for that Judean shepherd. He just calls to them. In fact, in some cases, he would have individual pet names for the sheep. And he could call to one of them by name, and that one sheep would come. It was that kind of a close relationship. And so he just called until all his sheep are out, and then the gatekeeper would close the gate again. The other sheep would be left inside. That's the image that Jesus creates. But he said only the shepherd goes in through the gate. Anybody who climbs over the wall or tears a hole in it is up to no good. He's trying to steal the sheep. He's not the shepherd. The sheep don't know him. If he tries to approach them, they're going to run from him. Jesus uses this figure of speech, and they don't understand it all. He describes the way the true shepherd behaves. They don't get it. And again, remember the chapter that has just taken place. The story of the blind man. Before he had seen Jesus' face, he recognized his voice. When Jesus healed him, remember, he put the mud on his eyelids, told him to go wash, so the man's sight was not restored until after Jesus was gone. Later on, when they encountered one another again, it was Jesus' voice that he recognized. He didn't know what his face looked like, but he knew that voice. And so that imagery follows through, and you see the connection between the two chapters here. The blind man was one of a growing multitude of people who had come to recognize the voice of Jesus as that of the Messiah. Well, the critics didn't get it, so Jesus repeats himself and expounds on what he said. Verse 7. So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters. He flees because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord, and I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father." All right. Jesus proceeds to do something that my English teachers years ago told me to never do. He mixes his metaphors. It makes for poor English, but it made for effective teaching in Jesus' day, and Jesus wasn't bound by the rules of modern day English. In one part of what he's saying, he is the door of the sheep. Next sentence, he's the good shepherd. He uses these images interchangeably back and forth because, after all, the metaphors are simply devices to try to communicate a bigger point. It's not important that the metaphors are mixed or that the imagery gets confused, because the whole point of what he's doing is to communicate a bigger truth. And it's about his relationship with his people and how that contrasts with the relationship that the Jewish leaders had with the people. So don't get hung up on the mixed metaphors. In the one hand, the metaphor, the door, teaches one aspect about Jesus' relationship with his people. The metaphor, the good shepherd, teaches another aspect of it. It's all part of the same lesson, though. He refers to those who came before as treacherous impostors, not loving shepherds. And at this point, I don't think it's doing injustice to what Jesus is saying to think not just about the immediate context of the Jewish leaders, but of the whole history of God's working with his people and how he had sent righteous prophets and teachers and leaders. But alongside them, there were those who would seek to mislead the people, to lead them into sin. And so this problem is one that had existed from time immemorial, as God tries to work through people to lead his people into righteousness, while others are trying hard to undo God's purposes. He refers to all those ways that were in opposition to the leading of those whom God faithfully sent in the past. In the same vein, Jesus' words, "the sheep did not listen to them," doesn't mean that none of the Jews had ever been misled by false teachers. The reality is quite the contrast. In fact, many were. But there was a faithful remnant of faithful worshipers that hearkened only to the voice of God. And again, we're talking about a pattern that we see repeated in Scripture for generation after generation after generation. You can go all the way back to Moses. You can follow the history of Israel through the judges, through the Davidic and Solomon kingdom, through the ages of the prophets. And you can see this pattern where there will be a time when the people are being faithful in their worship to God. And they're under the watchful eye of a righteous leader. And that righteous leader would die. And there would be a time of falling away. But even in the darkest hours, you could always find a small righteous remnant. Sometimes it got really small. And sometimes it was all but invisible to the contemporaries at the time. Think about Elijah. Elijah, when he had that great confrontation with the prophets of Baal on top of Mount Carmel. And God sent fire from heaven to consume the offering that Elijah offered. And then Elijah, practically the very next day, is running for his life. He fears that he's the only righteous prophet left. And he doesn't know what God knows. That there are others who were faithful. They were just in hiding. But always there was that righteous remnant. And so this is the pattern that we see here. There were always some sheep that listened. Whoever makes Jesus their gate will be saved. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. This image of Jesus as the gate that provides protection for the sheep. It's inside the gate that they're safe in the fold. And Jesus said there's only one way in, and that's me. Which belies the increasingly popular notion in our culture today that there are many paths to God. And that people just simply have to be allowed the freedom to find God on whatever path they're most comfortable walking on. Well, that all sounds so very sweet until you read what Jesus says. And he said every other way leads you to perdition. There's only one way, and that is through the gate. He says there in verse 9, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture. Saved, it carries with it the idea of deliverance from danger. Outside the fold, there were all kinds of dangers. There were people who would kill you and eat you. There were predators, wolves, leopards, lions, bears, all kinds of animals that would just be more than happy to have mutton for supper. The sheep are notoriously helpless animals. They don't run particularly fast. They don't have fangs. They don't have claws. They can't fly. They have even a big ram is no match for a run-of-the-mill predator. Jesus offers to his sheep life to the full. I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. Now, at this point, you have to watch out for false teachers, because there are multitudes out there in our world today who read that and say, God is promising you wealth and health and prosperity in this life. Don't buy it. That's not what Jesus is selling. We shouldn't confuse life to the full with material prosperity or freedom from difficulties or uninterrupted emotional ecstasy or perfect physical health or any of the other things that people out there will promise you if you'll just send them your check. You know, what was that old song? Lord, won't you get me a Mercedes Benz? There's a lot of people out there singing that song. Think again about chapter 9, the blind man. Jesus promised him abundant life, and he gave him back his sight. But what happened to the blind man after he got his sight back? He was insulted. He was ejected from the synagogue. He was probably, as a result, rejected by his peers and his own family. He paid a high price for his vision, especially for that insight that he had that helped him to see who Jesus was. Life to the full does not denote problem-free, painless bliss. It rather refers to the quality, the ultimate value, and eternal reward of life lived in relationship with and obedience to God through Jesus, the gateway to life. Having contrasted his leadership with that of his opponents, Jesus now describes his character and how it differs from theirs. He is the good shepherd. The mark of a good shepherd is total commitment to his flock. When necessary, he puts his life on the line to protect them. The image here is of, if you would, the owner-operator. These are his sheep. He's got a significant financial investment in them. They represent his livelihood, his economic security, his hope for the future. He lose those sheep, he could starve.